A little boy nervously walks into an army general's office. "I'm here for the interview." The man, surprised at first, freezes in shock when he learns who the boy's father is, and why he's really there. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The military base buzzed with efficiency, soldiers marched in formation, boots hitting the pavement in unison, and orders crackled over radios. Among the sea of uniforms and authority, a small figure weaved purposefully between the legs of stern-faced men, his chin lifted and eyes fixed ahead. Tommy wore his father's old army jacket, the sleeves rolled up awkwardly and the hem brushing his sneakers. A pair of toy dog tags clinked softly with every step. His hair was combed back with too much gel, and he clutched a piece of notebook paper folded into a precise square, his resume. The guards at the gate had been too stunned to stop him. Perhaps they assumed the boy belonged to someone on the base, or maybe it was the sheer determination in his eyes. Either way, Tommy made it past the checkpoints without question, his small feet padding down the corridor leading to General Marcus Hayes' office. He found the door slightly ajar and didn't hesitate. Pushing it open with more force than necessary, Tommy marched in and stopped directly in front of the broad wooden desk. General Hayes was hunched over a stack of reports, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and the day's weight. He didn't look up immediately, assuming it was one of his aides. "I'm here for the interview, sir," Tommy announced, standing at attention, his tiny hand snapping up in a salute. The general's pen paused mid-signature. For a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. When Hayes finally raised his head, his eyes landed on the pint-sized soldier standing rigidly in front of him. Tommy's salute was a bit crooked, and his boots weren't standard issue, bright red laces against worn-out sneakers. But his gaze was steady, almost defiant. Hayes leaned back in his chair, one brow lifting in a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. The weight of the day eased, just a fraction. The general cleared his throat, covering the hint of a smile. "I see," he said slowly. "And what position are you applying for, son?" "Private," Tommy replied instantly, then hesitated. "Or maybe a sergeant. I haven't decided yet." Hayes clasped his hands together, elbows resting on the desk, and nodded with a grave sort of seriousness. "Fair enough. Do you have a resume?" Tommy unfolded the crumpled paper and held it out with both hands. Hayes took it, smoothing the creases. In large, uneven handwriting, it listed qualifications like, "Can make my bed, brave enough to fight monsters," and "good at finding things." Hayes' lips twitched. He cleared his throat again, forcing the amusement down. "Impressive," he said, tapping a finger against the "brave enough to fight monsters" line. "We could use more of that around here." Tommy's chest puffed out a bit. "I also don't cry when I scrape my knees," he added proudly. The general's expression softened. "A valuable skill," he agreed. "Mind if I ask why you want to join the army?" The confidence faltered for the first time. Tommy looked down at his sneakers, then back up with a seriousness far too old for his 6 years. "I need to find my dad," he said quietly. "He's Captain Ethan Carter. He's been gone for a really long time." Hayes' hands clenched subtly on the arms of his chair. The name struck with the force of a bullet, Ethan Carter, the soldier who had saved his life in a fiery ambush 6 months ago. The soldier who had covered Hayes' retreat with a grim smile and a promise to follow right behind. Only he never did. The guilt was a dull ache that never left, one he buried beneath endless reports and meetings. But here it was, raw and unavoidable, standing in an oversized jacket with a pair of too bright eyes. Tommy took Hayes' silence as uncertainty and pressed on, words tumbling out faster. "I know I'm a bit young," he admitted, "but I can learn fast. And I promise I won't be scared. I just need to find him and bring him home. Mom cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping." The confession hung in the air, stark and unvarnished. Hayes exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy with the weight of it. For all his years in command, He had no idea how to respond to this, to a boy determined to fight monsters no child should ever have to face. After a long moment, he cleared his throat, voice rough. "Finding soldiers is a bit above a private's pay grade," he said, keeping his tone light. "But how about this? I look into it, and you keep training in the meantime. Deal?" Tommy's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion sharpening his gaze. "Do you promise?" he asked, small hand extending across the desk. Hayes hesitated only a second before clasping the tiny hand in his own, the grip firm but gentle. "I promise," he said, the words soft but unbreakable. The boy's expression brightened with a smile that was half relief, half determination. He released the general's hand and stood straighter. "Thank you, sir," he said, saluting again with more precision this time. Hayes returned the salute, throat tight. He watched as Tommy turned on his heel and marched out of the office, head held high and shoulders squared with purpose. When the door clicked shut, the weight of guilt settled heavier than before. Hayes stared at the crumpled resume on his desk, the childish scrawl and lopsided letters, and exhaled slowly, the promise echoing in his mind. He reached for the phone, jaw set with grim determination. "Get me everything we have on Captain Ethan Carter," he ordered. "And make it fast." General Hayes stared at the door long after it closed behind Tommy, the boy's crayon-written resume still lying on his desk. The promise he'd made echoed in his mind, a weight settling deeper with every second. He'd been called many things, ruthless, unfeeling, a by-the-book commander, but never a liar. He intended to keep that promise, no matter what it took. The phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. Hayes snatched it up, voice gruffer than intended. "Any updates on Carter?" "Working on it, sir," came the reply, efficient but non-committal. Hayes grunted and hung up, running a hand over his jaw. He was already bracing for a long day when his aide stuck his head in, eyes wide. Sir? There's a woman here, Tommy's mother, and she's demanding to see you." Hayes barely had time to frown before Emily Carter stormed in, her strides quick and her eyes fierce. The aide, looking apologetic and slightly frightened, retreated with haste. Hayes had faced insurgents and enemy fire without flinching, but Emily's glare made him sit up straighter. "Are you out of your mind?" Emily snapped, hands planted firmly on her hips. "What kind of military base just lets a 6-year-old wander in like it's a theme park?" Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off with a jab of her finger. "And what kind of general lets him stroll into his office and play soldier?" Hayes waited, arms folded loosely, until she paused to breathe. "I didn't let him do anything," he said calmly. "The kid's resourceful. I doubt even special forces could have stopped him." Emily's glare sharpened. "This isn't funny." "It wasn't meant to be," he replied unbothered. "But you have to admit, the kid's got guts." She exhaled sharply, somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. Hayes watched her shoulders slump a fraction, anger giving way to exhaustion. For the first time, he noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tightness at the edges of her mouth. "Is he all right?" she asked, voice quieter. "Perfectly fine," Hayes assured her. "He's with Sergeant Davis, probably giving tactical advice on how to take down the mess hall." Emily's lips twitched despite herself. She pressed a hand over her eyes briefly, a shaky laugh escaping. "I'm so sorry," she muttered. "I don't even know how he got here." "He's determined," Hayes said, with a hint of something like respect. "Didn't break protocol either, saluted and everything." Emily snorted. "He's 6. Which makes it more impressive." She gave him a look, part exasperated, part amused. For a moment, the tension ebbed. Emily dropped into one of the chairs opposite Hayes' desk, her shoulders sagging. Hayes hesitated, then poured a glass of water and set it in front of her without a word. She blinked at it, surprised, but took a sip. "Thanks," she mumbled. Hayes leaned back, hands clasped loosely. "I've started looking into Ethan," he said, voice careful. "I'll keep you updated with anything I find." Emily's fingers tightened around the glass. Is there any news?" Not yet, he admitted. But I'm not giving up. Her eyes flickered, searching his face for insincerity, but whatever she saw seemed to settle her. She blew out a breath, tension easing. I appreciate it, she said quietly. An awkward silence fell. Hayes cleared his throat. Coffee? Emily quirked an eyebrow. Do you even drink coffee, or do you just absorb caffeine through sheer force of will? He huffed, something dangerously close to a chuckle. We can't all run on sarcasm and spite. She smiled, small and tired, but genuine. It softened the lines of her face, took years off the stress. Hayes looked away, focusing on a report that suddenly seemed much more interesting than it was. They made their way to the base's tiny coffee shop, where Emily raised an eyebrow at the sheer black sludge Hayes poured into his mug. I see you take your coffee the same way you take your personality, dark and intimidating. Didn't realize we were critiquing each other's coping mechanisms. Hayes replied dryly, though the corner of his mouth twitched. Emily took a long sip of her latte, smirking over the rim. Consider it a free service. The banter felt natural, easing some of the awkwardness. They talked, cautious at first, then more freely, about anything but Ethan and the war. Emily rolled her eyes at Hayes' tactical explanations for everything, while he endured her teasing with a kind of resigned amusement. Neither acknowledged the warmth that had settled between them, tentative but not unwelcome. Meanwhile, Tommy had taken to the base like a duck to water. He was found in the barracks demonstrating his combat roles to a group of soldiers who watched with barely concealed grins. When one tried to correct his form, Tommy glared fiercely and declared, "That's how my dad does it!" By the time Emily and Hayes returned, Tommy was perched on a crate, giving orders like a pint-sized commander. Emily pinched the bridge of her nose but couldn't hide her fond exasperation. "Are you causing a mutiny?" she asked, hands on her hips. Tommy grinned. "Maybe." Hayes fought back a smirk. "Promising leadership material," he noted. Emily huffed, but the tension in her eyes had eased. She ruffled Tommy's hair, the gesture soft and reflexive. "Come on, soldier. We're going home." Tommy wriggled free, puffing out his chest. "But the general promised to find Dad." The words hung in the air, stark and hopeful. Emily's gaze snapped to Hayes, wide and questioning. He met her eyes steadily, refusing to look away. "I did," he said, voice firm. "And I will." Something in Emily's expression cracked, relief, uncertainty, a flicker of gratitude. She swallowed, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you?" Hayes just nodded. No promises, no false hope. Just a quiet assurance, heavy with intent. The car pulled away slowly, Tommy waving from the back seat. Hayes stood in the lot long after it vanished, the cold biting through his uniform. His phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. "Sir?" came the voice, tense and urgent. "We've got a lead on Captain Carter. Alive, but it's not good." Hayes' grip tightened, pulse thudding hard in his ears. "Send me everything," he ordered. When he hung up, his hand was steady, but his jaw clenched tight. He glanced back at the road, eyes narrowing with resolve. The promise to Tommy burned fresh and unyielding. And this time, he wouldn't fail. The drive to the field hospital was long and tense, silence stretched tight between them. Tommy had talked nonstop for the first hour, voice bright with excitement, but now he was dozing, cheek pressed to the car window. Emily's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road. Hayes sat in the passenger seat, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The report lay heavy in his pocket, coordinates, medical assessments, a stark list of injuries that made his gut twist. He hadn't told Emily everything. Couldn't bring himself to say the words. The hospital loomed ahead, a cluster of dull tents and hurried figures. Emily parked haphazardly, barely waiting for the engine to stop before she was out, hauling open the back door to scoop Tommy into her arms. The boy stirred, blinking blearily, but woke fully at the sight of the tents. "Is Dad here?" he asked, voice small but hopeful. Emily's voice was tight. "Yeah, honey. He's here." Hayes followed, keeping a few paces back, the weight of guilt a solid thing in his chest. He'd faced worse, ambushes, firefights, choices that left him awake at night, but nothing felt as heavy as the sight of Emily's shoulders trembling or Tommy's wide eyes as they rushed through the makeshift corridors. A nurse directed them to a corner room, hushed and apologetic. Emily pushed the curtain aside without waiting, breath catching at the sight of the figure on the bed. Ethan lay propped against a thin pillow, eyes closed, skin waxy and bruised. Bandages peeked from beneath the hospital gown, one arm in a sling. For a sickening moment, Hayes thought they'd come too late. Then Ethan's eyes fluttered, a faint smile pulling at cracked lips. "Took you long enough," he rasped, voice thin but warm. "Thought I was gonna have to haunt you, Marcus." Emily let out a choked laugh that was almost a sob. Tommy, wriggling free, bolted for the bed, clambering up without hesitation. Ethan winced but managed to lift his good arm, wrapping it tightly around his son. "Dad!" Tommy's grin was blinding. "I told the general you weren't dead!" "I knew it!" Ethan chuckled weakly. "Good man," he murmured, ruffling Tommy's hair. His eyes flicked to Hayes, a glint of familiar mischief cutting through the exhaustion. "You look worse than me," he added, smirk crooked and faint but unmistakably Ethan. Hayes' breath left him in a rush, something uncoiling in his chest. He huffed softly, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You're not exactly a picture of health yourself, Carter." Ethan's smirk widened a fraction. "Flattery from you? Must really be dying." Emily swatted his shoulder lightly, half laughing, half crying. "Don't joke about that," she scolded, voice wobbly but fierce. Ethan's gaze softened. "Sorry," he murmured, squeezing her hand weakly. "Didn't mean to scare you." She sniffled, brushing at her eyes with the heel of her hand. "Idiot," she mumbled. Tommy, oblivious to the heaviness hanging in the air, launched into a breathless account of his mission to the base, complete with reenactments and dramatic salutes. Ethan listened, eyes crinkling with every pause, his hand never leaving Tommy's shoulder. Hayes stayed by the door, hands clasped behind his back, jaw tight. He couldn't bring himself to step closer. Couldn't look directly at Ethan's pale face or Emily's tear-bright eyes. When Ethan finally met his gaze, the teasing was gone, replaced by something raw and quiet. He motioned subtly, and Hayes hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Ethan's hand was cold, grip faint but steady as it clasped Hayes. The guilt surged hot and bitter, sticking like tar in his throat. He stared at the blanket instead, swallowing hard. Ethan squeezed once, a tired but knowing look in his eyes. No blame, just that same infuriating understanding that had made him such a good leader. Hayes' jaw clenched, but he couldn't force words past the guilt. Ethan's smile was faint but real. "Not your fault," he said softly. "Was my call. You did what you had to." Hayes' grip tightened, and he looked away, throat raw. Ethan just patted his hand weakly, eyes closing with a sigh that seemed to take all his energy. Tommy, still prattling about his future in the army, didn't seem to notice. He babbled on about basic training and commanding troops, his small fingers clutching Ethan's sleeve like a lifeline. Ethan's eyes softened as he listened, exhaustion carving deep shadows beneath them, but his smile never faltered. "Sounds like you've got it all planned out," he murmured, voice thin but warm. "Yep," Tommy beamed. "I'm gonna be a hero, just like you." Ethan chuckled weakly, eyes flickering to Emily. "You hear that?" he rasped. "Better keep an eye on him. He'll outrank us all." Emily's laugh was shaky, fingers brushing Ethan's temple gently. "We'll try," she promised, voice breaking at the edges. Hayes shifted, the guilt creeping back with every shallow breath Ethan took. His eyes flickered to the machines, to the pale face on the pillow, to Tommy's bright, unwavering smile. The nurse slipped in with an apologetic smile, murmuring about needing to check vitals. Emily, after a long moment, pulled Tommy close, whispering that his dad needed rest. The boy pouted but relented, pressing a sloppy kiss to Ethan's cheek before allowing himself to be guided away. Hayes lingered a moment longer, gaze darting between Ethan's half-closed eyes and the monitor that beeped too rapidly. He swallowed hard, words sticking like glass in his throat. "I'll be back," he said gruffly, voice low. "Promise." Ethan's eyes crinkled faintly. "Not going anywhere," he whispered, though the slur to his words made it ring hollow. Hayes nodded once, turning sharply on his heel before the cracks could show. The curtain fell closed behind him, the sounds of the hospital muffling into a dull roar. Emily was sitting with Tommy on a bench down the hall, fingers twisting nervously. She glanced up as he approached, eyes red-rimmed but determined. Hayes cleared his throat, dropping into the seat beside her with a stiffness that felt painfully out of place. "He's tough," he said quietly, because it was all he could offer. Emily breathed out shakily. "He has to be," she murmured, voice soft but sure. The minutes stretched long and heavy, broken only by Tommy's sleepy murmurs and the occasional nurse's footsteps. Then, too sudden and too sharp, alarms began to blare from behind the curtain. Emily's head snapped up, eyes wide and horrified. Hayes was on his feet before she could move, chest tight as the room flooded with doctors and nurses shouting orders. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, muffling a choke sound that made Hayes' heart slam painfully against his ribs. He stepped back instinctively, jaw clenched, but couldn't tear his eyes from the chaos behind the curtain. Through the flurry of movement, he caught a glimpse of Ethan, eyes closed, monitors flashing angrily, chest still. The promise rang hollow in his mind. The alarms blared sharp and unrelenting, a brutal counterpoint to the stillness that had settled in Ethan's hospital room. Hayes' feet moved on instinct, propelling him forward even as the nurses crowded in, blocking the view with their scrubs and hurried movements. Emily's hand gripped his arm, fingers trembling with a force that belied her outward calm. Her eyes were fixed on the curtain, wide and unblinking, as though she could will it to open and reveal everything was fine, that Ethan was still smiling faintly, cracking dry jokes through the pain. Tommy stirred against her side, half asleep and oblivious, one small fist clutching the hem of her jacket. Hayes glanced down, the tightness in his chest constricting further. He moved without thinking, guiding Emily and Tommy back a few steps, his own hands clenched tight enough to ache. It felt like hours, though the clock on the wall barely ticked forward. The alarms cut off abruptly, leaving a hollow silence that seemed worse somehow. A doctor emerged, eyes grave and shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," she said softly, words flat and practiced but no less devastating. Emily's breath caught, her grip slipping from Hayes' arm. For a moment she just stared, head shaking slightly, as if she hadn't understood. Tommy blinked up at her, eyes still hazy with sleep. "No," Emily whispered, voice hoarse and small. "No. The doctor glanced down, words faltering, but Emily was already moving, shoving past them, nearly tearing the curtain from its rings. Hayes was half a step behind, instinct pulling him forward even as his mind recoiled, clinging to denial. Ethan lay still, eyes closed and expression oddly peaceful, as though he'd simply drifted off to sleep. The machines around him were silent, displays flat and final. Emily's knees buckled at the sight, a broken sound escaping her throat. She stumbled forward, hands grasping Ethan's sleeve, voice cracking and desperate as she begged him to wake up, to stop playing around, to open his eyes just one more time. Her pleas shattered into sobs, raw and unrestrained, echoing painfully in the small room. Hayes' feet felt rooted to the tile, breath shallow and mind blank. The guilt coiled tighter, suffocating, every breath a struggle. He moved forward finally, hands awkward and heavy, resting them on Emily's shoulders without knowing what else to do. Tommy's voice, small and confused, cut through the chaos. "Mom?" he mumbled, rubbing at one eye. "Why are you crying? Is Dad?" His gaze landed on the bed, on Ethan's unnaturally still form. His words trailed off, eyes wide and searching. Emily turned, gathering him into her arms, words tumbling out in broken fragments. "Sorry, so sorry, it's going to be okay," though the lie cracked on the last word. Hayes took a step back, throat raw and tight. Ethan's face blurred, the guilt swelling until it was nearly suffocating. He forced himself forward, hands shaking as he reached out, intending to straighten the sheet or brush a stray lock of hair back, anything to feel like he was doing something. His fingers paused, eyes catching on a faint movement. Ethan's eyelids fluttered, a weak breath rattling in his chest. Emily's sobs choked off, eyes widening with a flicker of desperate hope. Ethan's hand twitched, fumbling blindly until it found Hayes' wrist, gripped so faint it was barely there. "Hayes," he rasped, voice paper-thin. Hayes leaned in instinctively, straining to catch the words. "I'm here," he managed, voice unsteady. Ethan's lips twitched, a faint echo of a smile. "Knew you'd find me," he breathed, eyes flickering open just enough to meet Hayes' gaze. His fingers tightened a fraction, voice fading with every word. "Promise me, Emily, Tommy, look after." His eyes fluttered shut, the grip on Hayes' wrist slackening. The heart monitor let out a dull, flat tone. Hayes stayed frozen, Ethan's limp hand still clasped in his own. The words echoed, hollow and damning. He squeezed his eyes shut, inhaling sharply, but the tears slipped past anyway, scalding tracks down his face. The funeral was held 3 days later, the sky overcast and heavy with the promise of rain. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, faces grim and eyes fixed forward. The flag-draped coffin rested at the center, flanked by a sea of flowers and somber uniforms. Tommy stood between Hayes and Emily, fingers twisting the hem of Hayes' jacket. He was pale and silent, eyes fixed unblinking on the coffin, lips pressed tight enough to turn white. When the gun salute rang out, sharp and final, Tommy flinched but didn't cry. He took a step forward as the bugle played, movements slow and mechanical, and raised a small hand in a salute, back straight and chin high. Hayes moved before he could think, stepping up beside him, stance mirroring the boy's. His spine was rigid, fingers trembling imperceptibly, but he held the salute until the last note faded. Tommy's hand dropped with a shuddering breath. Hayes stayed up a moment longer, jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the coffin. A tear slipped down his cheek, unbidden and burning, but he didn't lift a hand to wipe it away. Emily's hand found his, fingers threading tightly. He gripped back instinctively, holding on as though he might drift otherwise. Her shoulders trembled, breast shuddering against his side, but she didn't pull away. The weight of Ethan's last words pressed down, heavy and inescapable. Hayes exhaled slowly, eyes flickering to Tommy's small frame, to Emily's bowed head, and forced the promise past clenched teeth. "I'll take care of them," he whispered, the words quiet but steady. The mourners filed past, offering murmured condolences and sympathetic glances that blurred into a dull haze. Hayes stood still, grip firm on Emily's hand, until the last soldier moved on and the cemetery fell silent but for the rustling of leaves. Tommy glanced up, eyes red-rimmed but dry, and slipped his other hand into Hayes'. His fingers were small and warm, squeezing tightly, as though afraid Hayes might let go. Hayes' throat tightened, but he squeezed back, the words echoing over and over, Ethan's quiet plea, Tommy's muffled sniffles, Emily's soft, broken apologies. The path ahead seemed long and uncertain, the weight of the promise settling heavily on his shoulders. But Hayes straightened, squaring them with a breath that hurt, and watched as Emily led Tommy toward the car, steps slow and uneven. He stood in the quiet for a long moment, eyes fixed on the folded flag in Emily's arms, the glint of sunlight on toy dog tags at Tommy's neck. Then he followed, steps steady but hesitant, the path forward stretching dark and unfamiliar but with no choice but to walk it. The weeks blurred into months, a quiet sort of rhythm settling into place. The house, once hollow with loss, gradually came back to life, small signs at first. The steady hum of conversation over dinner, the soft flicker of TV shows watched from the worn-out couch, Tommy's laughter echoing down the hallway. Hayes hadn't meant to stay as long as he did. It started with a few repairs, fixing the leaky pipe under the kitchen sink, patching the hole in the garage wall, replacing the cracked window in Tommy's room. Simple tasks, just a way to keep busy, to ignore the weight that hadn't lifted since the funeral. But then one evening turned into two, a toolbox left in the hallway, a dinner invitation offered almost as an afterthought. Now, months later, he had a drawer of spare clothes in the guest room and a toothbrush beside Emily's in the bathroom. He still hesitated each time, fingers brushing the door handle before pushing it open, half expecting her to change her mind. But Emily never seemed surprised to find him there, just smiled softly, eyes warm and tired. Tommy had taken to shadowing him around the house, clutching a pair of toy binoculars and saluting at every opportunity. "Sir?" he'd chirp with a grin, mimicking Hayes' posture and tone with uncanny accuracy. It was both endearing and faintly unsettling, catching the boy peering around door frames or lurking behind the sofa with a stern frown that crumpled into giggles when caught. One afternoon, while replacing a light fixture in the hallway, Hayes caught a glimpse of Tommy standing at attention, brow furrowed in concentration. He hid a smile, adjusting the screwdriver with exaggerated focus. "Private," he greeted evenly, not looking up. "Status report?" Tommy's eyes lit up. "All clear, sir," he declared, snapping a salute that was only slightly crooked. "Good work," Hayes replied, tone grave. "Keep it up." Tommy puffed out his chest and scurried off, the binoculars bouncing against his neck. The hallway was quiet again, but Hayes found himself smiling, the warmth lingering long after the footsteps faded. Dinner was a different battlefield altogether. Hayes, who could manage an entire unit with precision, seemed hopelessly outmatched by a simple stovetop. Eggs burned, pasta overcooked, and one unfortunate incident with a blender that left tomato sauce splattered across the ceiling. Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed and eyes bright with amusement. Tommy, poking at a charred piece of chicken with his fork, wrinkled his nose dramatically. "Is it supposed to be black?" he asked, tilting his head. Hayes cleared his throat, nudging the pan with what he hoped was authority. "It's extra crispy," he said gruffly. "Army secret." Tommy snorted, trying and failing to hide it behind his hand. Emily chuckled outright, reaching to take the spatula from Hayes with a warm pat to his shoulder. "Maybe you should stick to fixing sinks," she teased, bumping him lightly with her hip. Hayes scoffed, but the corners of his mouth twitched. He didn't move back, her touch light and lingering for a breath longer than necessary. She took over seamlessly, turning burnt disaster into something passable. Hayes watched from the corner of his eye, hands stuffed awkwardly in his pockets, the soft hum of her voice and the steady scrape of a spatula strangely comforting. It wasn't just the dinners. There were the mornings, slow and unhurried, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, Tommy curled between them on the couch with a blanket over his head. There were the late-night conversations over mismatched mugs of tea, words soft and careful, edging around the emptiness Ethan had left behind. They didn't talk about the funeral, or the promise, but the weight of it hung between them, a constant reminder. Hayes had learned to navigate the silences, to catch the small glances Emily threw his way, the way her fingers brushed his sleeve when passing dishes, the soft curve of her smile at his dry remarks. Little things, unspoken but they're all the same. Tommy, blissfully oblivious, filled the gaps with chatter, stories from school, reenactments of battles fought with plastic soldiers in the backyard, tactical plans for capturing the cat next door. He'd taken to calling Hayes, "Sir," with increasing enthusiasm, following him from room to room, saluting with dramatic flair. It was almost embarrassing, though Hayes would never admit how much the simple title warmed something deep in his chest. The quiet stretched into something almost normal. Comfortable. Until one Friday night, after an ill-advised attempt at homemade pizza left the kitchen dusted with flour and burnt crust, they retreated to the living room with reheated leftovers. Tommy, half asleep between them, was snuggled into Hayes' side, head resting heavily against his chest. Emily leaned against the other armrest, legs tucked under her, a tired but content smile playing at her lips. Hayes kept his arm awkwardly around Tommy's shoulders, afraid to move and break the spell. The TV flickered with some cartoon Tommy had insisted on watching, colors bright and voices too loud. Hayes tried to follow the plot, something about talking animals and magic swords, but the weight of the boy at his side and Emily's knee brushing his distracted him entirely. In the lull of a commercial break, Tommy stirred, eyelids drooping but voice stubbornly awake. "Hey, sir?" Hayes glanced down, fingers absently smoothing the back of Tommy's shirt. "Yeah?" Tommy yawned, blinking slowly. "Do you love my mom?" The words were innocent, said with the bluntness only children could manage. But they seemed to echo, hanging in the silence that followed. Emily choked on her sip of water, cheeks flaring red. Hayes went rigid, eyes darting instinctively to hers, mouth opening with no words to fill it. Tommy yawned again, oblivious. "'Cause I think you do," he mumbled, snuggling further into Hayes' side. "It's okay if you do. I think she likes you too." Emily's gaze was fixed firmly on the TV, cheeks still flushed, hands twisting the hem of her sleeve. Hayes' throat was suddenly too dry, mind blank with a sort of stunned panic. He started, voice catching awkwardly. "That's well." Tommy was already asleep, mouth slightly open, breaths deep and even. Hayes clamped his mouth shut, ears burning. Emily cleared her throat, a nervous laugh escaping despite herself. "Well," she said lightly, voice a touch higher than usual. "That's kids, huh?" Hayes huffed out something like a laugh, though it sounded strangled even to him. His fingers were still curled gently around Tommy's shoulder, but he couldn't make himself move, couldn't force the air past the tightness in his chest. Emily's eyes flickered to his, brief and hesitant but warm, the corner of her mouth lifting. Hayes swallowed hard, the words sticking, mind reeling with 100 responses that all seemed equally wrong. He settled for silence, arms still around Tommy, Emily's knee pressed lightly against his own, heart pounding entirely too fast. The TV droned on, bright and oblivious. The promise he'd made echoed steady and unyielding, a quiet assurance that somehow seemed less daunting with Tommy's head heavy on his chest and Emily's hand resting just shy of his. The porch light cast a soft glow, pooling at their feet and stretching shadows across the worn wood. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and something sweeter, lavender maybe, from the bushes lining the driveway. Hayes leaned against the railing, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, gaze fixed on the dark outline of trees in the distance. Inside, the TV hummed with muffled cartoons, colors flickering through the curtains. Tommy had crashed on the couch an hour ago, one arm flung dramatically over his face, mouth slack in sleep. Emily had tossed a blanket over him with a fond shake of her head before stepping outside, the door clicking shut behind her with a soft finality. Hayes glanced over, catching the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, eyes warm but cautious. They'd fallen into an easy routine these past months, but the edges were still uncertain, lingering too long in doorways, fingers brushing in passing, stolen glances that neither addressed directly. The silence stretched, comfortable but weighty, filled with all the words Hayes hadn't said and didn't know how to. Emily leaned against the opposite railing, arms folded loosely, head tipped back to look at the sky. Her hair caught the porch light, softening the dark strands, and Hayes forced himself to look away before the lump in his throat grew any tighter. "You're quiet tonight," Emily remarked, voice light but questioning. "Thinking," Hayes mumbled, the word gruff and inadequate. She smiled faintly. "About what?" His jaw clenched instinctively, mind blanking with a sort of panicked finality. He cleared his throat, fingers fidgeting inside his pockets, tongue heavy and clumsy with the words that stuck. "Just stuff," he managed lamely, grimacing the second it left his mouth. Emily huffed a laugh, rolling her eyes. "Insightful," she teased, one brow lifting. Hayes' ears burned, and he shifted, weight bouncing from one foot to the other. The porch creaked under the movement, a low groan that seemed deafening in the quiet. He stared resolutely at the railing, gripped tight enough to ache. This was ridiculous. He'd faced enemy fire, insurgents, missions that turned sideways with half his team pinned down, and no exit in sight. But this? Confessing feelings to a woman who smiled at him like the sun might break any second. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs, breath shallow and uneven. He cleared his throat again, the sound raw and awkward. "About what Tommy said?" The other night. Emily blinked, brow furrowing. Tommy says a lot of things, she pointed out, amusement coloring the words. Hayes' mouth flattened into a line. You know what I mean, he muttered, voice barely more than a rumble. The smile faltered, eyes flickering. Her fingers stilled on the railing, grip tightening fractionally. She didn't look away, but the uncertainty crept in, quiet and hesitant. Hayes sucked in a breath, shoulders rigid. Look, I'm not good at this, he grumbled, voice flat but earnest. Talking, I mean. Or feelings. Or anything remotely resembling this. Emily's lips twitched, but she stayed silent, head tilting slightly in quiet encouragement. I wanted you to know, he forced out, the words rough but steady. That it's real. That I care. About you. And Tommy. His fingers flexed instinctively, jaw tight. More than I should, he admitted, the confession low and raw and terrifying. The silence that followed was absolute. Hayes' heart thudded, loud and deafening, palms damp inside his pockets. Emily just stared, eyes wide and lips parted slightly, as though the words hadn't quite sunk in. Then, slowly, she laughed. Soft and incredulous, one hand flying to her mouth, eyes crinkling with a warmth that settled every frayed nerve in his chest. Hayes' face burned, and he scowled instinctively, shoulders hunching. Yeah, okay, laugh it up, he muttered, scowl deepening. Emily shook her head quickly, the laugh trailing off into something softer, voice thick and breathless. I'm sorry, I thought. She swallowed, eyes flicking to his with something raw and bright. I thought you'd never say it, she finished quietly. Hayes shifted, ears burning. Well, I did, he grumbled, voice barely above a whisper. Her smile softened, eyes shining. You did, she agreed, voice warm. Hayes barely had time to register the warmth of her hand curling around his collar, the slight pull forward, before her lips brushed his, soft and tentative and unbearably warm. He froze, brain flatlining for a full second before instinct kicked in, hands rising to settle gingerly at her waist. The kiss was awkward and shy, a little too fast and uncertain, but real and warm and enough to make Hayes' heart stutter painfully. Emily's fingers tightened, nose bumping his with a quiet huff of laughter, and Hayes squeezed his eyes shut, letting himself fall into the warmth and softness and everything that was Emily. She pulled back just enough to rest her forehead against his, breath shaky but eyes bright. Hayes' hands stayed firm at her waist, heart still pounding, the world narrowed to the soft smile that curved her lips and the warmth of her fingers at his collar. Took you long enough, she teased, voice light but fond. Hayes huffed, but the sound was weak and unsteady. Shut up, he muttered, though the words were softened by the tremble in his voice. She laughed softly, fingers brushing the back of his neck. Neither moved to pull away, the silence stretching warm and easy, punctuated only by the crickets singing somewhere in the dark. Tommy, upon discovering the newfound closeness, took to it with all the subtlety of a hurricane. The next morning, he strolled into the kitchen with a smug grin, eyes flicking between them with a knowing tilt to his head. So, he drawled, dragging out the word. Does this mean you're staying forever? Hayes, who had been in the middle of trying not to burn pancakes for the third time that week, choked. Emily snorted into her coffee, eyes dancing with poorly hidden laughter. Tommy, she scolded, but the grin tugging at her lips ruined the effect. Tommy grinned wider, hopping onto a stool with the confidence of a general. You should, he added matter-of-factly, pointing a fork at Hayes. Mom likes you. I like you. Plus, your pancakes are better than hers. Hey, Emily protested, swatting at him with a dish towel. Tommy just snickered, ducking. Hayes cleared his throat, ears flaming, but the shy smile Emily threw him over her mug made the embarrassment a little more bearable. The warmth lingered, settling deep in his chest. It lasted until the phone rang that afternoon, cutting through the lazy quiet. Hayes moved to answer instinctively, fingers brushing the receiver before pausing at the grim tone on the other end. The voice crackled with static, but the words were clear enough to sink like stones in his gut. "General Hayes? We've got new orders. Overseas deployment. Departure set for next month." The warmth froze, draining from his chest. Hayes' hand tightened around the phone, breath catching, eyes darting to the kitchen where Emily was laughing at something Tommy said, head tipped back and eyes bright. His throat worked, jaw clenched. "Understood," he bit out, voice flat. jerky nod. I will, he mumbled, voice thick. Promise. The first video call was a disaster. Hayes had never been good with technology at the best of times. Buttons too small, instructions vague and unhelpful, but the spotty connection and flickering screen were new levels of infuriating. The camera cut out twice, leaving him scowling at a blank screen until Emily's voice crackled through, faint and tinny but warm enough to ease the knot in his chest. Tommy's face lit up the moment he appeared on screen, eyes bright with delight. You're sideways, he snorted, giggling behind his hand. Hayes grunted, frowning at the phone. It's supposed to do that, he muttered, shifting the screen. Sure, sir, Tommy snickered, eyes glinting. Next time you should send a carrier pigeon. Emily's laugh rang warm and clear through the static, and Hayes rolled his eyes but couldn't quite hide the smile that tugged at his mouth. Then the call stopped. The message came 2 months later, short, clinical, every word a knife between Emily's ribs. She read it 3 times, hands shaking, vision blurring at the edges. Convo ambushed. Mia. Status unknown. She sank onto the kitchen floor, the letter crumpling in her fists, breaths coming short and sharp. Tommy's footsteps thundered down the stairs, voice muffled but worried, but she couldn't make herself move, couldn't force air past the tightness in her throat. The days that followed were hollow. The phone stayed silent, every ring or knock at the door sending her heart lurching painfully into her throat. Tommy lingered by the window, dog tags clutched tightly in his hands, eyes red and puffy but dry. Nights were worse. She lay awake, the bed too cold and too empty, staring at the dark ceiling and replaying every word, every smile, every half-spoken promise that might never be fulfilled. Her chest ached with every breath, a dull and endless pain that refused to fade. It was 3 weeks later, the sun slanting pale and indifferent through the kitchen window, when the phone rang, sharp and shrill in the suffocating quiet. Emily nearly dropped it in her rush, fingers trembling and clumsy, voice cracking on the greeting. The line buzzed, crackling with static, and then a voice, familiar and flat, professional and careful. Ma'am, it said, tone grave. We've received new information. General Hayes, he's still missing. The knock at the door came at sunrise, slow and steady, shattering the silence that had settled thick and suffocating over the house. Emily sat up sharply, heart pounding loud and painful against her ribs. The blankets tangled around her legs as she stumbled to her feet, breath shallow and eyes wide. She'd stopped opening the door quickly after the first few weeks, too many visits from officers in stiff uniforms with their practiced condolences and clipped words. But something pulled her forward now, feet moving before her mind could catch up, hands trembling as she twisted the knob. The door creaked open, and the world narrowed to the figure on the porch, tall and unsteady, one arm in a sling, uniform dusty and torn, face gaunt and bruised but unmistakably, impossibly real. Hayes. Emily's breath left her in a choked, half-broken sound, eyes blurring instantly. Hayes' mouth twitched faintly, almost a smile, but it faltered, exhaustion carving deep lines into his face. He leaned heavily on the crutch, one leg bandaged stiffly, and for a heartbeat neither moved, just stared, breath short and shallow and disbelieving. Then Emily surged forward, arms wrapping tight around his neck, face pressing into his shoulder with a shuddering breath that broke into a sob halfway through. Hayes grunted softly, free arm coming up slow and hesitant to settle around her waist, fingers curling into the back of her shirt like he was afraid she might vanish. You're here, she choked, voice muffled and shaking. You're really here? Yeah, Hayes rasped, voice rough and low. Told you I'd come back. She pulled back just enough to cup his face, thumbs brushing carefully over the bruises, eyes scanning every inch of him like she couldn't quite believe it. Her hands trembled, breaths coming short and shaky, but her eyes were bright, half desperate and half overjoyed. The sound of pounding feet on the stairs broke the moment, and then Tommy was there, barreling down the hallway, eyes wide and mouth falling open. Sir! He shouted, voice cracking with disbelief. Hayes barely had time to brace himself before Tommy crashed into him, arms thrown around his waist with a force that nearly sent him off balance. The crutch slipped, but Emily was there in an instant, hands steadying his shoulders, eyes glistening with fresh tears. Hayes huffed out a breath, the sound half a laugh and half a wince, hands settling gently on the back of Tommy's head. "Easy there, kid," he muttered, but the words wavered unsteadily. Tommy's fists clenched tighter in his jacket, face buried in his chest, shoulders trembling. "You came back," he mumbled, voice muffled and thick. "You really came back. Promise, didn't I?" Hayes said softly, fingers brushing through Tommy's hair. Tommy sniffled, nose scrunching against Hayes' chest. "Took you long enough," he grumbled, voice wobbly and petulant. Hayes chuckled hoarsely, head tipping back against the doorframe, eyes fluttering closed for a moment. "Yeah," he murmured, voice rough but warm. "Sorry about that." The sun dipped low that evening, sky streaked with gold and soft purple, the air warm and heavy with the scent of grass. Hayes leaned back against the porch railing, fingers fidgeting absently with the hem of his sleeve, eyes fixed on the horizon with a mix of nerves and exhaustion that made his chest tight. Emily sat beside him, one knee tucked up to her chest, hand resting lightly on the back of his. Tommy was sprawled across the porch steps, humming to himself and spinning one of Hayes' dog tags between his fingers, oblivious to the tension winding tight between the adults. Hayes cleared his throat for the third time in as many minutes, eyes darting to Emily and then quickly away, tongue clumsy and thick in his mouth. He could face down insurgents and lead troops through enemy lines without flinching, but the thought of getting these words out was enough to leave his palms damp and heart stuttering. Emily arched a brow, eyes glinting with amusement. "You good?" she asked lightly, lips quirking. Hayes huffed, ears burning. "Fine," he grumbled, voice flat. She smirked, head tilting with playful curiosity. "Uh-huh," she drawled. Hayes scowled at the horizon, fingers flexing nervously. "Just stay still," he muttered, voice rough and a little panicked. Emily blinked, confused, but before she could question it, Hayes pulled a small box from his jacket pocket, nearly dropping it twice in the process. His fingers fumbled with the lid, movements stiff and awkward, ears red enough to burn. Emily's eyes widened, lips parting. "Marcus, look!" Hayes blurted, words tumbling out in a rush. I'm not good at speeches or romantic stuff or any of that. But I don't." His throat bobbed, breath unsteady. "I don't want to do this without you," he forced out. "Any of it." Her eyes shone, mouth trembling with a smile that was half a breath from breaking into tears. Hayes' fingers tightened around the box, jaw clenching, breath coming too fast. "So," he cleared his throat harshly. "Marry me?" he rasped, voice barely above a whisper. Emily's laugh cracked into a sob, hand flying to her mouth. She nodded frantically, tears spilling free, the smile on her face wide and unsteady. "Yes," she choked, voice thick. "Yes, of course." The relief hit like a sledgehammer, knees nearly buckling with the force of it. He let out a breathless laugh, hand shaking as he slid the ring onto her finger. Emily threw her arms around his neck, laughter breaking between muffled sobs, and Hayes clung back, eyes squeezed shut, heart thundering painfully fast. The wedding was simple, a small gathering on the base, rows of chairs draped in white, soldiers in uniform standing at attention. Hayes stood at the altar, fingers flexing nervously at his sides, throat tight and palms damp. When Emily stepped into view, all soft smiles and white lace, Tommy grinning wide and proud at her side, the breath left his lungs in a sharp, unsteady rush. His hands trembled when she took them, fingers lacing between his, eyes bright and steady. The vows were simple, voice low and rough with emotion, words faltering but sure. Hayes' eyes stung, vision swimming, but he forced them out, breath hitching when Emily squeezed his hands, eyes warm and endless and home. When Tommy hugged him afterward, arms tight and fierce around his waist, face pressed into his jacket with a muffled "Love you, Dad," Hayes' heart nearly stopped. His hands trembled, breath shuddering, but he hugged back, eyes squeezed shut, the words sinking in slow and deep. That night, Under a sky lit with fireworks and laughter echoing across the field, Hayes wrapped an arm around Emily's waist, the other holding Tommy close, heart full and light. Tommy giggled, eyes wide and bright, hands clapping with each burst of color. Emily leaned into his side, eyes warm and soft, fingers curling into the front of his jacket. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so dark. Hayes pressed a kiss to Emily's temple, smile breaking slow and unsteady, and let the warmth settle deep, right where it belonged. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.